tasks and computational methods. And most recently, Dr. Corlett has become a commentator on the psychedelics field, where he's already earning a reputation for his rigorous voice and ongoing research, including major questions in the field, like whether or not psychedelics truly do change beliefs, and also a notorious commentary on a major Nature medicine paper on psilocybin in treating depression, which he'll talk to us all about today. Dr. Corlett has received numerous accolades throughout his career, including just a few, like the Wellcome Trust Prize studentship, being named a rising star and feature opinion leader by Pharmaceutical Marketing Magazine, and most recently, the Outstanding Translational Research Award from the Schizophrenia International Research Society. And I note in looking up Dr. Corlett before this, that among his many achievements, he is also an Adidas shoe collector, and he once met Jackie Chan. So if you weren't planning on sticking around for the Q&A, at least stick around for those. Before I let him talk, I want to lay out the structure of the talk real quick and some basic rules. So Dr. Corlett's going to talk to us all for about an hour. The rest of the time will be used for Q&A. Please stay muted during the talk, although Dr. Corlett said that if you do have a question, just please feel free to unmute and interrupt him. That's the best way to ask a question if you're curious about something right on the slides right there and then. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand feature, and YPSG monitors will be watching, and they'll try to interrupt for you, so you can ask your question, or you can also send your question in the chat and have it addressed during the Q&A. And then last but not least, just a reminder that this talk is being recorded. So if that's not okay with you, hop off now. Without further ado, I'll hand things off to Dr. Corlett so we can learn some things about psychedelic research. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Max and Alec, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity to maybe convince some of you that I'm not just the guy who fights with people on Twitter and then write about it. But I wanted to try and give a little bit of context to some of those disagreements, and hopefully point towards what I think might be some sort of fruitful ways forward. So as Max mentioned, in my lab, the Belief Lab, we work on the sort of varieties of human beliefs and perception, including delusions and hallucinations. And really what I'm going to talk about today sort of summarizes that work that I started in Cambridge and kind of brought across the pond here to Yale, wherein we were trying to understand something about the neurobiology and cognitive neuroscience of delusions and hallucinations in the context of schizophrenia by modeling those processes with infusions of ketamine, the NMDA antagonist. And around about this time, this was when ketamine began to have its kind of resurgent identity as an antidepressant. And sort of since then, I've been wrestling with how this work that I'm going to share with you today might have relevance to those antidepressant effects. And I think through sparring with and engaging with the burgeoning psychedelics literature, as well as the ketamine literature, I think the learning processes that I'm going to show you today might have something to do both with the acute effects of these drugs, and I'm going to include ketamine as a psychedelic, even though it's not a classical serotonergic hallucinogen. It does change people's perception and beliefs. So acute effects, but maybe also the longer lasting effects too. I'm not convinced that those necessarily happen. They certainly don't happen in everybody. They're exciting if they do. And I think we need some empirical science to try and figure out and convince ourselves that they do actually happen. And what I'd like to suggest, and I'd love your feedback on, is whether or not what I'm proposing might be helpful in that regard. So this is from a paper that I wrote in 2009 about ketamine and psychedelics and various psychotomimetic interventions and how they might induce the effects that they do. It's a precursor to the Rebus model, and it makes some different predictions from the Rebus model. And I'm going to show you data that I think confirm the way I see things and sort of contradict the Rebus model, at least in how it was initially phrased. So the idea is that we make predictions. Our brain contains a model of the world. And those that model generates predictions that we compare to incoming sensory inputs. And if everything balances out, then we perceive and go about our day and nothing particularly disruptive or perturbing happens. However, if the balance between what we expect based on our world model and our inputs is disrupted, then strange things can happen. So in the case of delusions, what I'm going to suggest to you and what we've been arguing over the years is that there's a bias towards bottom-up sensory inputs in the absence of strong top-down beliefs from our world model. And that perturbs perception away from the sort of mundane and towards things that seem kind of ineffable, unusual, and sort of scary. Like the conclusion that rather than being confronted with a hairdryer, you're confronted with somebody who has a gun to their head. That's when the bias is towards prediction errors and not towards predictions. And on the other hand, when the bias is towards predictions, we can have perceptual experiences even in the absence of any inputs at all. And so what I'm arguing is that hallucinations and perhaps the effects of serotonergic hallucinogens are actually driven by stronger top-down beliefs and prior beliefs rather than weaker ones. I don't have any evidence for this in the setting of psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. I'm going to show you some ketamine data along those lines, and you can tell me what you think. So this is our definition of delusions. They're fixed beliefs in light of, not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. And the key term here is beliefs. So we're going to take our kind of cognitive neuroscience and what we understand about belief formation and belief updating and see what it can tell us about delusions. Here's an example. A 74-year-old married housewife believes her husband has been replaced by an unrelated man who's living in her house with her. And so she refuses to sleep in the same room as the imposter. She locks herself in her room and she asks her son to get her a gun to protect her from this person. This is an example of what we call the Capgras delusion. It was discovered in Paris in the early 1800s. It occurs in the context of schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, as well as in the context of neurological insults like stroke and closed head injury. And indeed, when we look at all the case reports wherein the locus of damage caused by head injury or stroke is reported and the presence of these monothematic delusions like Capgras is reported, we can see that across patients and cases that are reported in the literature, we can catalog whether there's damage in frontal cortex, parietal cortex, temporal cortices, white matter, subcortical structures, and occipital structures. And what I've done here is just draw a line between two structures if they're damaged at the same time in the same patient. And the line is thicker the more commonly a particular structure is damaged at the same time in the same person. And what you can see is there's a preponderance of damage in the right hemisphere, and perhaps right frontal cortex in particular is a bit of a hub when it comes to giving rise to these monothematic delusional beliefs. We want to try and put some sort of psychological meat on those neurobiological bones, which is really the crux of my talk today and what I want to convince people who do psychedelics research to do too. So we want to have a task that we give people, and we want to relate the task.
Yeah.
Is there a question?
The doses are the fourth.
Can people
No?
please mute themselves?
Okay. All right. So the task that we want to focus on is something really, really basic and reductionist. It's the idea that we can understand belief formation and belief updating in terms of the same math and ideas that give rise to Pavlovian conditioning in experimental animals. So here what I'm showing is a ticking metronome. When the dog is first exposed to this metronome, he doesn't have a particularly strong response. However, if the metronome is paired with a valued food reward like this tasty steak, then the animal will salivate when he receives the steak. And through enough pairings of metronome with steak, he'll come to salivate in response to the metronome in anticipation of getting the steak. So our idea here is that causes and effects get associated in our minds through exactly the same processes. And the model through which we tried to understand this is called the Rescorla and Wagner learning rule. It was developed in psychology at Yale in the 1970s by two psychologists, Bob Rescorla and Alan Wagner. And it's really an overly mathematical way of saying that we learn from our mistakes, and we learn most when those mistakes are largest. So the term in brackets, lambda minus the sum of v's, is the mismatch between what you expect given all the cues that you've been presented with and what you actually experience. And the bigger that term is, the more you form and strengthen associations. And so the idea is that if that signal, that prediction error signal, is happening when it shouldn't in your brain, that's going to make you attend to and learn about things that you really ought not to. And in a really nice review about this, prediction error relates to the very essence of learning. No learning occurs when outcomes are perfectly predicted. And so what I'm going to show you is that too much prediction error, or prediction error happening when it shouldn't, makes you form delusional beliefs. And we test this. Apologies for the hamburger. I know it's lunchtime. You're probably all really hungry. We test this by asking people to imagine that they're an allergist. They're going to see foods that a patient of theirs has eaten, and then they're going to see whether or not he has an allergy. So you see hamburger, you see that he has an allergy. Your task is, when you see a food or a meal on the screen, make a prediction about what you think is going to happen and hold the key down longer the more confident you are you're making the right choice. So hamburger, allergy. Every time you see hamburger, you see that he has an allergy. Hamburger, allergy. You start to predict allergy confidently. In the next phase of training, we pair that hamburger with a novel food that you don't know anything about, in this case, bananas. And you see an allergy happening of exactly the same magnitude. So hamburger, bananas, allergy. The prediction is already completely carried by the hamburger. There's no prediction error. So you shouldn't really learn anything new about the bananas. You shouldn't even really attend to them or think about them. And indeed, that's what happens if you're a control participant. When you see the hamburger after this training, you have a very strong expectation, confident expectation that you're going to see an allergic response. You're sort of equivocal with regards to the banana. It might be causal, it might not. You don't have much of an opinion. If you are a participant who is acutely psychotic, you don't develop enough of a strong belief about the bananas, and you aberrantly imbue you don't have a strong enough belief about the hamburger, and you aberrantly imbue the bananas with causal significance. Paul Fletcher, who was my advisor in grad school, put it really nicely that important things feel different when you're psychotic, and different things feel important. And these are just behavioral data, but let's show you what goes on in the brain when people process these sorts of prediction error signals. So here what I'm showing is across a whole host of studies in healthy people, whenever they do this kind of food allergy causal learning, when we surprise them and show the allergy when it shouldn't happen, or no allergy when it should happen, we see a really robust and precise signal in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So much so that we think we can kind of use it as a fingerprint for the presence of prediction error in the context of these sorts of tasks. And so when we place people in the scanner, our control participants, and we show them the food that they've sort of thought doesn't cause the allergy, now causing the allergy, we see this nice, robust response in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And again, as expected, not much of a response to their predictions about the banana sort of coming true. So not very interested in things that are predictable. However, if you're a participant with first episode psychosis, again, important things feel different. They're not as surprised by things that should be surprising, and they're far too surprised by things that shouldn't be surprising, that should be highly predictable and run-of-the-mill. And we can summarize this effect from our fMRI data in this particular region by just the difference in the height across participants of these two bars. And we can correlate that with the severity of their symptoms. And indeed, what we see is people who have more delusions have a smaller difference in the height of those two bars. They have prediction error signals in their brains that are in response to events that really shouldn't be surprising. And the more they have that, the more severe their delusions are. Even taking symptoms and medication doses and socioeconomic status and all of these other factors that could be confounding. Seems to be a very specific relationship between this psychological process, its neural instantiation, and the presence and severity of this particular symptom of delusions. Now, as I mentioned, we can use drugs like ketamine, and I'd like to argue psychedelics too, to induce delusion-like ideas and hallucination-like experiences very briefly and transiently and reversibly. This is an example of somebody who was in one of Cyril D'Souza's studies, who said that every time the scientists left the room, they thought another person dressed in their clothes was coming back into the room. It wasn't scary, just another person dressed in those clothes, doing the job, a little older and weighing a bit more. So something a bit like the Capgras delusion. Obviously, it's not their partner who they know very well. There's a certain sort of depersonalization, derealization flavor to it, but for all intents and purposes, it's a fairly good experimental model for Capgras-like experiences, which is something that we haven't had before. So we can summarize those experiences with rating scales, and we can get people to do our cognitive task, our causal learning prediction error task, whilst they're on this drug. And we can look at the relationship between this type of phenomenology and what's going on in people's brains. What we see on placebo is just like what we saw in the control case. So when you see events that are surprising, you see a nice robust signal in this right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex region. When you see events that really aren't surprising, that don't induce a prediction error and shouldn't induce a prediction error according to the theory, not much of a response in that right DLPFC region. However, when you're on ketamine, your brain responds to our task just like you have first episode psychosis. Not as much of a response to the surprising events, too much of a response to the unsurprising events. We can summarize this again as the difference in the height of these two bars. And just like in the first episode psychosis case, exactly the same brain region inappropriately engaged during our task is associated with aberrant salience experiences and delusion-like ideas, these ideas of reference that people have on ketamine, that someone is maybe talking about them behind their back. There's more going on than the experiment, that they're in danger in some way. So again, very specific association between inappropriate engagement of that brain region during our task whilst people are on ketamine relative to placebo, and more severe delusion-like and hallucination-like experiences when someone is on ketamine. And the nice thing is that we kind of know somewhat about the neurobiology and neurochemistry of ketamine, right? It binds to NMDA receptors, particularly on GABAergic interneurons in prefrontal cortex, and might cause a disinhibition of this region, which would be consistent with the idea that it's sort of hyper-engaged when it really ought not to be, and hypo-engaged when it's really ought to be. So some evidence across these studies that there's a relaxation of expectations, inappropriate imposition of prediction error signals where they shouldn't be, and some inappropriate learning and inference that might give rise to delusion-like ideas and hallucination-like percepts. We've gone on to kind of replicate this with other beliefs that are on a continuum in the general population, right? So 60% of Americans believe at least one conspiracy theory. We can tap that with Emmanuel Peter's delusion inventory, which asks about 20 different delusion-like ideas. For example, do you ever feel as though your thoughts are alien to you in some way? And you might say yes. And if you say yes, that triggers these other questions. How distressing do you find it? How often do you think about it? So how preoccupied are you by it? And how convinced are you that it's true? And the bottom line from Emmanuel's work is that you can find people out in the world who don't have schizophrenia, who endorse as many beliefs, who are as preoccupied by these ideas, who are as convinced that these ideas are true, but they're very rarely as distressed as patients with schizophrenia. And so what we can do is summarize the distress of our participants in our healthy control study. These are just graduate students and undergraduates and healthy volunteers from the community who don't have a psychotic illness, who nevertheless might hold their beliefs in a delusion-like way. The more distressed you are about these odd beliefs, the more likely your brain responds to our task, as if you're on ketamine or as if you have first episode psychosis. So if you hold your odd beliefs like delusions, we can detect that in your brain activity whilst you're doing our task. So far, so good. Delusions involve aberrant prediction errors. I think this might be the area where I might have some agreement with the Rebus model. I think delusions arise when there's a failure of predictions to constrain current perception. But interestingly, the hallucinations might be a slightly different story. So I'm going to tell you that story now and see what you think. So with hallucinations, they're percepts without an external stimulus, occurring in a conscious and awake state, having all the qualities of real perception. This is what's going on in people's brains whilst they're having an auditory verbal hallucination in the scanner. And I show these data from the late Ralph Hoffman in collaboration with Michelle Hampson, because I think they're really interesting. So typically what you would see in this type of symptom capture study is what's going on in this column here. This is what's happening in someone's brain when they push the button to report that they're hearing a voice in the scanner. And what you can see is 3 seconds before they push the button, there are all these sort of interesting activations and deactivations in frontal cortex, in auditory cortices that are sort of fulminating before they report hearing the voice. And then there's all this interesting stuff that's going on up to 5 seconds afterwards. Actually, the regions the dopamine-rich regions where the drugs that we give to treat these illnesses actually bind aren't coming online until like 4.5, 5 seconds after they report hearing the voice, suggesting that perhaps what happens when we treat with these compounds is that we modulate people's attributions towards the experiences rather than the machinery that's giving rise to the experiences themselves. How are we going to show that empirically? Well, we're going to take the Pavlovian approach again, but this time we're going to build sensory associations. So there's no cause and effect necessarily, except between cues in the task across different sensory modalities. And we can use exactly the same types of paradigms to induce perceptual expectations and sort of confirm or refute them. Here's an example. So this is a rotating hollow mask of Charlie Chaplin's face. It's going to rotate towards you clockwise. As you start to see the inside of the mask, something interesting is going to happen. Around about now, it's going to seem as though the direction of rotation flipped. It didn't actually flip, but in order to make sense of the perceptual information that's incident on your eyes from this sort of ambiguous stimulus, your brain infers that the mask changed direction because you have a pretty strong prior that faces point outwards and that light falls in particular ways on concave versus convex objects. And so to make this make sense, you infer that the direction of rotation switched. Now, people typically say that patients with schizophrenia don't see this sort of illusion as strongly, and that's true, but we have new data that suggests that patients who hallucinate are actually more susceptible to this effect. Interestingly, ketamine doesn't actually disrupt your perception of this illusion, but cannabis does. It actually makes you perceive it more veridically, so you actually start to see the inside of the face. And I think that's another fruitful line of inquiry, perhaps useful in the psychedelic setting when people might not be able to engage with these sort of complex inferential tasks, although I think it's still possible for them to do that if we're careful and come up with clever, innovative approaches. But the bottom line here is if your perceptual expectations are too strong, they can override your sensory inputs. And in the case of hallucinations, those expectations might be so strong that they make you perceive things that really aren't there. This auditory example I don't think was working very well earlier, but we'll give it a try. So you should hear a sort of R2-D2-like series of clicks and whistles there. Now if I play you this.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
And then I play you the original stimulus again. You should actually be able to hear the speech in that sine wave stimulus. This is an example of what's called sine wave speech. It was developed at Haskins' lab in the 1980s. So that's on the 9th floor next door to the main psychiatry offices. And what they were trying to do in that lab was find disruptions that they could make to speech to make it completely unintelligible, and then they could put the frequencies back in, encourage people to perceive it again. And what they found almost by accident is that once exposed to the template stimulus, your brain has a way of organizing those sine wave stimuli, and now you can't unhear them. And with lots and lots of practice, I can now kind of generalize. And so when other people use different sentences in their talks to demonstrate this effect, I can often hear them, which is a little bit troubling given this result.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
This result here from my colleague Ben Alderson-Day, who shows that non-clinical voice hearers, so people who hear voices in their everyday lives, are actually able to detect the speech in those stimuli before they're even told that speech is present. So they don't need to hear the template, they can detect and decode the speech that's present, suggesting that perhaps people who hallucinate have strong priors on the presence of speech out there in the world, and therefore can detect speech even under very ambiguous conditions. And this fits into a sort of broader model of what the brain might be doing in terms of forming a model of what must be out there in the world in order to make our sensory inputs make sense. That model is reasoned over through something like Bayes' theorem, where you have a hypothesis, you mix it with some data, and you decide whether or not, in light of those data, it's a good idea to update your future hypotheses or downweight the input or the influence of the data. And that might be cashed out across hierarchical layers in your certainly sensory cortices, but I'd like to argue association cortices too, wherein predictions are sent top down, prediction errors are communicated bottom up, and their relative weighting is influenced via various neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, and acetylcholine. Again, neuromodulators that are involved in the treatments that we give, certainly the pharmacological ones, but also in many of the sort of interesting psychotomimetic and psychedelic drugs that we expose people to. So again, I'd like to argue that LSD and psilocybin might well derange this calculus. And unlike people like Robin Carr-Harris, my suggestion is, to the extent that something is a serotonergic hallucinogen, the end state ought to be a bias towards top-down beliefs. This is how we're going to go about and test it through Pavlovian conditioning. I'm really fond of this quote. Evidently, what the genius Helmholtz, who came up with this idea of unconscious inference, was referring to is the mechanism of the conditioned reflex. So we set out to try and test that. This is a really nice example too, wherein your experience with large objects and how they tend to move and the sounds that they tend to make when they collide with irresistible forces like the ground. About 50% of people report hearing a loud sound and a bang when they see the camera shake and they see the pylon hit the ground. We wanted to have a paradigm that could kind of explore and teach new expectations like these and look at the impact of them on perception. And this is work done with Al Powers, who was a resident at the time and is now, I'm happy to say, a faculty member with us at Yale. We were inspired by a long history of this sort of work on illusions and hallucinations and teaching people to have hallucinatory experiences in the lab that dates back to the 1890s at Yale. We induced conditioned hallucinations using a paradigm inspired by this paper by Doug Elson from the 1940s. And essentially what we do is bring people to the scanner and figure out the intensity of tones that we need to play them so that they detect them 75% of the time, 50% of the time, which is their threshold, and 25% of the time. So it's sort of harder to hear. And then of course we can play no tone at all. So that's 0 intensity. And then we take those tones and we impose them on this training task, wherein a checkerboard stimulus flashes up on the screen and a tone of one of those intensities is played. So every time you see a checkerboard, you hear a tone. And after a while, we occasionally throw in trials where we show you the checkerboard, but we don't play the tone. And the question is, do you report hearing a tone conditional on the presence of this visual stimulus? And what's going on in your brain when you make such a report? And in order to get around demand characteristics and sort of experimental expectation effects, we actually conditioned very strongly early on in the early blocks. There's lots and lots of those above threshold tones being paired with the checkerboard. But over time and across task blocks, there's more and more opportunities to make these conditioned hallucinations. There's more and more times that people see the checkerboard but aren't presented with the tone. And the question is, do they report hearing that tone? So early on, we build up the association, and then later on, we kind of break the association. And we do this in 4 groups of people: a group of people who have schizophrenia and hear voices, a group of people who have schizophrenia and don't currently hear voices, a group who have neither schizophrenia nor hear voices. Those are just our standard controls. And then this non-clinical voice hearer group who believe that they're psychic and hear auditory messages. I can tell you more about them perhaps in the discussion. They don't meet diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, but they do, according to all of our methods, hear voices in their heads at least once a day. And the take-home point from all of this work is that if you are somebody who hears voices in your head, regardless of whether you're someone with schizophrenia, you're much more likely to report hearing tones in our task that we didn't present you with. So about 10 times more likely to show the effect in hallucinators than non-hallucinators. Everybody gets it a little bit, but the hallucinators get it much more strongly. It happens particularly at those below threshold intensities. So when no tone is presented, or when the sort of quieter, less intense tone is presented at 0.25 of threshold. So when sensory uncertainty is higher, people rely on their prior beliefs more strongly. It correlates with the severity of voice hearing outside of the lab. So more conditioned hallucinations in the lab, more voice hearing outside of the lab, regardless of your clinical status. The tones engage regions of the auditory hierarchy, including the superior temporal sulcus, which is sort of useful and reassuring. So when people are doing that initial thresholding procedure, when the tones are going up and down in intensity and we're figuring out how loud we need to play them, the tone, for it to be heard over and above the noise of the scanner, you see a nice robust activation in this superior temporal sulcus region that goes up and down with tone intensity. We can make a mask out of those regions and look during the conditioned hallucination trial. So when we show you the checkerboard, we don't play you a tone and you report hearing a tone, there's a really nice robust response in those tone sensitive regions, which is consistent with the idea that they're actually hearing something. Although I wouldn't want to put too much weight on that claim, it's consistent with the idea. Outside of that region of interest, we see great swathes of activation across the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the anterior insular cortex. So across all participants, these are the regions of the brain that are engaged when people report hearing tones that we didn't play them. And when these are the regions of the brain that in a meta-analysis show up in all of those button push symptom capture studies for people who are hearing voices in the scanner and just pushing a button when they are currently hearing a voice. And I think you'll agree there's a really nice and satisfying overlap between our circuit and the circuit identified by symptom capture from that meta-analysis, which is really nice because, of course, not everybody hallucinates frequently enough in order to have symptom capture. And we might even be able to use this task as a way of deciding or discerning who might be likely to go on to have psychotic illnesses and hear voices from a prodromal or a risk state. We can fit a computational model to these data to figure out what people are believing about the task and how those beliefs are changing. So in this middle layer, this is, do you believe that tones are occurring in the task? Are those tones being predicted by the checkerboards? And how are those tone checkerboard associations changing over time with increased volatility that we introduced into the task? We can use that model to simulate data and we get exactly the same results. So we don't think that we're overfitting. We think it's a good model. It recapitulates the experimental data, which is always reassuring. And what we see is that there's no difference in this inverse temperature parameter. So it isn't the case that people say with voices are just saying yes to everything or making more noisy responses. There's no difference at that level. However, people who hear voices in their heads tend to overweight the prior beliefs that they've developed in the context of the task. We can estimate that, how much they're using their past experiences to inform their current experiences. So people who show more conditioned hallucinations, people who hallucinate more in their everyday lives tend to overweight their prior beliefs. It's computational evidence in favor of a particular account of how hallucinations come about, and one that I'd like us to try and use in the context of psychedelics to be really clear about what might be happening in that case. People who hear voices in their heads have stronger beliefs that tones are occurring and that those tones are being predicted by the checkerboards. However, if you're a patient with schizophrenia and not a psychic or a control, you're slower to update your beliefs in light of the evolving evidence. So there's a really nice dissociation that can describe what it is to be a voice hearer and what it is to be a voice hearing patient in particular. I mentioned that we can use this to perhaps pick out who might be at clinical high risk for psychosis. These are behavioral data gathered in young people who are in that high risk state. They show more conditioned hallucinations on the task. We've yet to see whether that cashes out in terms of actual prediction of who will convert to psychosis, but we're gathering those data now. We also replicated this effect. So these are data gathered with Pantelis Leptogos and colleagues at Baltimore in Maryland at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. So again, people are in the scanner, they're doing the conditioned hallucinations task. If you're somebody who hears voices, you're much more likely to show the conditioned hallucinations effect. And again, there's a correlation between hallucination severity and the presence of these conditioned hallucinations in our task. What we did differently this time, though, was rather than fMRI, we actually measured levels of glutamate in the brain in various different voxels right after someone had completed doing the task. So if you remember our circuit, one of the key nodes was the anterior insular cortex. We also measured glutamate levels in the auditory cortices, in the anterior cingulate, and in right DLPFC. So sort of all regions that might be relevant to hallucinations and psychosis. And we got a very strong and specific relationship between prior overweighting and having less glutamate in your anterior insular cortex. So the same structure, now using a different imaging modality and measuring neurochemistry this time, lining up, I think, with some of the suggestions that we made earlier on about delusions and the effects of ketamine. Again, if you drop the level of glutamate in someone's brain in a particular brain region, what we see here is overweighting of their perceptual priors and more conditioned hallucinations. We want to try and drill down on that effect and understand it and unpack it more clearly, and we turn to animal experiments. This is beautiful work, came out in Science last year from Katrina Schmack, where she developed a signal detection task, rather like the types of tasks that I've shown you that she could administer in mice and in humans. The idea is that both mice and humans make high confidence false alarms. They're a bit like our conditioned hallucinations, if you like. They're reporting a stimulus that wasn't present with a high degree of confidence. And in the human case, if you report more hallucinations outside of the lab, you report more high confidence false alarms. So a sort of conceptual replication of our conditioned hallucination effect and how it relates to everyday hallucination-like experiences. The really nice thing that Katrina did, though, was give ketamine to mice who were doing this task and showed that ketamine induces many, many more high confidence false alarms. Now, the story in Katrina's work is that she can manipulate the dopamine system and induce these high confidence false alarms. But we think that, that ketamine and glutamate might also be a really interesting candidate in light of these particular data. So there may be a ketamine story that goes alongside with or supplements the dopamine story here too. Just showing you these data. So as I mentioned, ketamine can kind of reliably induce these perceptual aberrations, like, for example, describing the world as becoming spaghetti-like, vertical lines pervading the vision, the noise of the scanner turning into music, like the Yellow Submarine by the Beatles, and seeing animated characters from that movie walking across the screen whilst people were on ketamine. As I mentioned, we can sort of give that drug not just to humans, but also to rodents, and we can kind of really drill down and look at the underlying kind of psychological mechanisms that might relate to some of these strange changes in perception and belief. And we think that mediated learning might be another candidate, in addition to our sort of Pavlovian conditioning experiment, that maybe brings some more different ideas about hallucinations sort of into the fold. So in this paradigm, we pair an odor with a taste, and then we deliver the taste. We assume that the odor is brought to mind, and we look at the extent to which any learning that takes place operates not just on the present stimulus, so the taste, but also the odor. And we do that by making the animals sick in the presence of a re-evoked representation of the odor and tracking how much learning about that nausea tracks to the absent but expected stimulus, the odor. So how sick do they feel? How aversive do they find the odor when they haven't even encountered it in the presence of nausea? The idea being that this rich re-evocation of the absent but expected stimulus might be some way of modeling hallucination-like percepts in animals. So we're going to test that, but we're also going to look at the effect of ketamine on this particular phase of learning. So if ketamine boosts how much they learn about the absent but expected stimulus, you might expect or might infer that they're experiencing and encoding that retrieval of that stimulus much more richly, and it's garnering more new learning. So this is a rather complicated experiment. There were lots of controls, but the kind of key result is that a high dose of ketamine impairs direct learning. So it makes it harder to consolidate and learn that the taste is associated with the aversive stimulus, not so much at a lower dose, no different from placebo at the lower dose. And that key lower dose that didn't affect direct learning actually enhances mediated learning. So when you're on a low dose of ketamine, perhaps one that induces in humans the sorts of aberrant perceptual experiences that we're mentioning, you are more likely to engage in more of that mediated learning. So there's a richer and sort of stronger evocation by learning into memory, into perception of an absent but expected cue that's then available for new learning. So we think we've got an animal model for hallucinations. We can sort of enhance it with interventions that induce hallucinatory-like experiences in humans. We can run experiments with psychedelics here. We actually have a human version of this task too, so we can insert it into task settings where others are giving these psychedelic and psychotomimetic infusions too. So the bottom line here is hallucinations involve the overweighting of perceptual priors, the constraint of perception by memory and belief, rather than relaxed beliefs. Now, I've had a lot to say about my own data. I want to try and contextualize those data and some of the arguments and disagreements that I've been having in the field. I think it's pretty clear why I don't think that a simple relaxed beliefs under psychedelics explanation captures the phenomenology of hallucinations or delusions alone. And what I want to try and suggest is that if you want to have something to say about very rapid belief updates, which we think might be the mechanism underlying some of the remarkable clinical effects of psychedelics, that there's various things that you want to take into account in terms of what might count as reliable and useful evidence that these rapid updates are actually taking place. I think the first issue, and one that we really need to grapple with, is collider bias. So far, most of the work that's been published in healthy volunteers, at least, is either with people who've already experienced psychedelics or people who are doing sort of self-report online surveys and telling you that they're about to take psychedelics, that they have indeed taken psychedelics, and these are the effects that they've had. I think there's a lot of issues about the types of people who might volunteer and be interested in these studies. And that counts in the clinical literature as well. I think there are some pretty strong expectancy effects that are driven by people's past experiences, as well as media depictions of what happens when you take psychedelics, and as well as all of these sort of almost daily media reports of the miraculous effects of these drugs. Those are bound to change people's expectations and might well manifest richer clinical effects. It's very hard to blind ketamine. It's very hard to blind psychedelics relative to placebo. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's something that we don't do enough to acknowledge. One possible idea would be to deliver psychedelic infusions whilst people are unconscious, so whilst they're sedated or anesthetized. I don't know about the safety or propriety of that, or how there may be interactions with different anesthetics, but I think it's an interesting way to get a handle on how important the profundity of these psychedelic experiences, these hallucination-like experiences, might be for the manifestation of the clinical effects. I'd love to see that study done. I'd love to collaborate on a study like that. I'd like to try it myself. And then I think the disagreement and the sort of arguments that I've been having with Robin Carhart-Harris in particular is that I think there's a lot of reverse inference that takes place. It's almost like neurophilosophical in a sense, that people report and they record these very profound experiences whilst someone is on the drug, and even in the aftermath of the drug. And they relate those in some way to some untethered resting state fMRI data that are gathered before, during, and after the ketamine infusion. Those brain responses are untethered by any kind of task. But because of the language of Bayesian belief updating and the Bayesian brain that's been popularized by people like Carl Friston and myself, people seem to feel, particularly in the psychedelics field, sort of free to make that reverse inference jump from a brain signal to a belief. I'd like to see some task data intervening, either gathered before, maybe during, certainly after, constrain the types of inferences that we can draw from these sorts of studies. And as I mentioned, what many of you probably know of my contribution to this field is through fighting with people on Twitter about the outcomes of their experiments and the ways in which those experiments have been communicated to the community as a whole and to society more broadly in the media. So, as many of you know, Twitter is an online sort of social media platform wherein you can create an account, share ideas in very short bursts of 140 or 280 characters. You can follow other people and see the sorts of things that they say. It's a great opportunity to share new work, to generate ideas, to have debates and discussion. I'm fond of this quote from Hunter S. Thompson. I think it extends to Twitter also. I hate to advocate drugs, alcohol, violence, or insanity to anyone else, but they've always worked for me. So Twitter's worked quite well for me in terms of staying connected with the field, getting early access to new data, but it also has this sort of downside of being somewhat combative at times. And here's an example. So this was Robin tweeting about their new Nature Medicine paper that they just published, wherein they republished clinical trial data on the effects of psilocybin on depression. And then alongside that, so they'd already published those data in The Lancet. The data didn't read out significantly, although there were some trends towards a significant clinical effect. They then changed the endpoint and republished those data and published data from a subset of participants who'd also undergone some fMRI scanning at rest. And these were the data. So I asked, did the lack of significant between group interaction give you any pause? This is on the fMRI side of things. The change in modularity that they reported was not significantly different between the groups. There was no between group interaction. And typically when you do this sort of work, that sort of interaction is the thing that licenses you to conclude that one treatment has a different effect from another treatment. I didn't think that they'd met that bar. The reviewers didn't necessarily agree, although we can come back to that shortly. And then when you look at the data themselves, it's pretty clear that the baselines were very, very different for the two groups. There was a much lower baseline for modularity for the group that got citalopram, which was the comparator treatment, relative to the group that got the psilocybin, which is kind of, one of the reasons why it might look like there are profound effects of psilocybin on this particular brain measure, but it actually has all of the hallmarks of being sort of regression to the mean, right? When you measure something twice, you have extreme responses in one group, but not the other. And then those extreme responses normalize the second time around. So there was a difference at baseline too. Robin's response was that I was clearly upset about this and the media coverage in particular. Good dissemination is important, but we can't control journalists' choice of language. I completely disagree with this because the language was coming from Robin and from David Nutt. They were giving quotes that said, we're rewiring the brain and during depression. Neither of those things were true. I said I wasn't upset, but I'm kind of astounded that it passed peer review at Nature Medicine and a bit troubled that he didn't see the problem with the lack of interaction, with the fact that many of the tests that they conducted were one-tailed in favor of their particular interpretation, and with the fact that they switched outcomes from their pre-registered plan. So this led to us writing a preprint, which I'm now happy to say is published, not in Nature Medicine. They refused to go forward with the critique. I'm not entirely sure why, although I can come up with some hypotheses. It's now published elsewhere. And Robin and his colleagues replied that they were very famous and had lots and lots of papers and citations, and that because they'd worked so hard to get psychedelic research back on the map, that maybe it was a bit mean of us to challenge them, and that with their 71,000 citations, who were we to criticize them, which I think is preposterous. And my reply was equally preposterous. So I might not have as big an H index. I'm not a member of any Royal Colleges, but I did have the cheekiest smile in the northwest of England in 1985, and therefore disagreeing with me would be a cheap shot, just like they accused us of making. Obviously, people took notice. So this is the article that was written by Shayla Love from Vice about the disagreement. Take a look at it, because I think it does a really good job of summarizing the key issues. And I felt quite edified by this particular response. So McConway is a statistician from the NIH, and he agrees with our criticism entirely. So you can't conclude that a significant difference in one group and a lack of significant difference in another group doesn't necessarily mean that the interaction will be significant. It's a standard thing that many people get wrong. It's wrong. There's no other way about it. The critics, which is myself and Manoj and Fred, were right. And he's leaning over backwards so as not to be inappropriately rude to the original authors, but they didn't understand what they were doing. And I think this type of sort of sloppiness gets through and gets into higher impact venues because everyone's excited about the opportunities and the possibilities with psychedelics. And I guess I would just sort of implore you as people who are interested from the field that being excited about something and really wanting it to work is not a reason to lower our standards. I think it's a reason to have higher standards and hold ourselves and the data and the work to higher standards. That's what I'm going to be trying to do. And I hope you all agree that that's the way to bring the possibilities here to a more sort of fruitful clinical reality. So I'm going to stop there and suggest that delusions seem to form in the context of prediction errors, perhaps in the face of weaker conceptual predictions, that hallucinations involve strong prior beliefs and prior perceptual beliefs, and that we can modulate those two things with NMDA receptor antagonists across species and kind of have some fruitful ideas about strength and weaknesses of beliefs that might well relate to the clinical effects of ketamine on depression, and the clinical effects of psychedelics more broadly. And I think this predictive processing is a helpful framework as long as you gather some behavioral data and see whether or not the predictions that you're making are actually true. I'd like to see what happens with serotonergic hallucinogens, and I'd like to see if any of the therapeutic effects of either ketamine or LSD or psilocybin might be understood in the context of this framework. And I will stop there and thank you and thank the people who did the work and funded the work, and all of the great people I get to talk to every day. And I'm happy to answer questions. I think we have about half an hour left to chat and discuss. That was what I was aiming for. And thanks for the opportunity to chat to you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Corlett. Everyone give a virtual Zoom hand, please. And we already have a hand up. Please just hit the raise hand button. If you have a question, you can leave it up unless somebody else asks the same question. Andrew Ding, you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks for the really rich and very thought-provoking talk. My question was what your comments were on the concept of like non-dual thinking and how this like interacts with your understanding of it.
My understanding of what, sorry?
Of non-dual thinking, like non-binary thinking, like trying to hold two ideas in the same time.
I see. So like cognitive dissonance?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't studied that in the context of any kind of drug treatment yet. We have looked at self-deception, which is wherein people claim one belief but act in a different way. And we have paradigms and models that explain that. Interestingly, people who self-deceive tend to be more paranoid. And they seem to do that not because they find other people more powerful or more reliable sources of testimony, but that they feel badly about their own performance. And so they're more likely to take on board the suggestions of others even if they're not necessarily others who are working on their team or on their side. And again, that cashed out in a very similar computational model. Now it had two arms, one for your own experiences and one for the advice of other people. And what we saw was there was an underweighting of your own experience and an overweighting of the advice, regardless of whether that person was on your side or not. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to use this framework to understand those sorts of odd and unusual beliefs. And I would be amazed if in some people, these sorts of interventions didn't resolve some of that, like lack of self-esteem and self-deception.
I was thinking the implications for neuropsych testing and how we conceptualize people could be really changed by a lot of this.
Right. But the only thing I would add is that, for all of the people who feel better after these sorts of infusions, there's always the risk that these specific processes and mechanisms might be augmented in the context of a drug infusion. And so I think doing these things in advance to make sure that it's safe and appropriate for somebody to undergo one of these infusions might be a really helpful step to take.
Thank you. Can I ask one more then?
Sure.
You had a brief slide about high doses impact on learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about the case of severe acute trauma. And there are moral questions about this certainly, but if somebody sort of has a advanced directive for traumatic incidences in their life, whether they're a soldier or they're in some occupation that predisposes them to that of saying, oh, if something happens, I want very high dose ketamine. So does this imply a lower likelihood of PTSD when you give it in that setting?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. So there are two big studies that I know on this topic in particular. One is with soldiers, right? So ketamine is often used as a field anesthetic. And when it's used in that context, people who got ketamine in the field tend to have less PTSD after their injury. However, civilians, and particularly people who've undergone very severe burns, and are given ketamine right after the burn, actually have enhanced PTSD. And I don't know why that is. It could be set and setting. It could be the sort of relativism of how bad the injury could have been. And it could be, the ruminative processes that are engaged afterwards, either having a positive or negative tone, depending on whether you're a veteran or a civilian. But it, again, points to this idea that for some people, these interventions can be extremely helpful, but for others, they might make things worse. And I think that's something that we need to face up to as a field, as we start to do these things more routinely.
Thanks.
Brad?
Hey, thank you, Dr. Corlett. It was a great talk. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned kind of the difficulties in interpreting resting state fMRI data. And I was wondering, given kind of the potential difficulty of engaging in tasks while, on any of these substances, what types of tasks do you think would be most valuable to have in these states? Or what do you envision would be, tasks to do in an fMRI instead of relying solely on the resting state?
Absolutely. So that, these are all really hard problems. Everything that I raised it's not trivial to solve. I'm not trying to say people are being lazy, and I don't have all of the answers either. That being said, I think it would be possible to do something like the tasks that I showed you, certainly prior to the infusion, so you could get a sense of where people are in terms of weighting their prior beliefs and sensory inputs across a whole host of modalities. I think that after a psychedelic infusion, that there's a sort of afterglow window wherein people are not currently having profound experiences, but they might still be in a window of plasticity. I think that would be interesting. You could do any of those tasks during that window too. I think some of the illusion, sort of perceptual illusion work could be done very easily whilst someone is on and experiencing profound effects of psychedelics. So showing them the hollow mask, looking at their sort of binocular rivalry would be possible. Not without challenges, right? We did a ketamine study with VR and everybody threw up. Like, it does happen, and you know, you learn as you go. But I think this idea that people are so sort of out of it that they can't do anything at all is a bit of an excuse. And I'd much rather have some challenging and weak behavioral data than to engage in this sort of post hoc mandala rationalization of looking at resting state data, wherein you can tell yourself any story at all that you care to.
Thank you.
Colleen?
Hi, great presentation. I was wondering, can you speak a little bit to the use of ketamine for people that do have hallucinations and schizophrenia, you know, who are dealing with like suicidality or severe treatment resistant depression, and like whether or not they are candidates?
So I've been a little bit scared of that. I don't think that's something that we should be doing with people with schizophrenia who hear voices. You know, I think we should remember the history of the development of this work and these ideas, wherein Dr. Crystal did an amazing job of figuring out how to do this work ethically and appropriately in people with mental illness and healthy controls. And even still, he came under great fire for giving ketamine to people with psychotic illness who were remitted and showing that they went back to the same pattern of symptoms that they experienced before they were in remission. There was a huge investigation by the Boston Globe, caused all kinds of trouble. So I'm reluctant to suggest that that's something that we should be doing, and I don't think that it is something we should be doing. And indeed, a history of psychotic illness is a rule out for certainly the research studies, and I think the treatment too. However, it's interesting, right? Psychotic depression is something that happens, and I believe it's used in that context, although I'm not sure, certainly off label. And I'd be very curious. I have a kind of a strong prediction about that. And, you know, one idea would be, you know, if everything that I showed you is true, people with psychotic depression, when they're given ketamine, excuse me, or to develop the Cotard delusion that they've died, and that delusion might the extent to which they have that experience might correlate with the profundity of how their symptoms resolve after the infusion. We don't usually track the specific psychedelic effects of ketamine during these infusions. It's not something that people talk about greatly. I think it would be really useful data. And I think it would speak to this issue of whether you need to have the strong kind of psychotomimetic effects in order to manifest the antidepressant effect. And in doing so, we might learn something interesting about the types of delusional beliefs that people form and the way that content comes about, which is something that we don't really know a great deal about. But my strong prediction would be that those people who have a sort of history of depersonalization and derealization and depression would be the ones who would have, you know, a Cotard-like belief when they're given ketamine.
I just wanted to quickly draw attention. I know Varun has a question, but just to the comment in the chat by Alice Linehan about some work done at Stanford with Boris Heifetz and giving ketamine to patients with depression while under anesthesia. I had seen, and it looks like that there was clinical benefit because Phil, you had raised this idea earlier in the talk. And I also know that there's a study at University of Wisconsin currently where they're co-administering psilocybin and midazolam. And one of the lead investigators in that study is Chris Nicholas. And I think he's going to talk to us sometime after the new year about some early data on that study, which will be really interesting. So stay tuned for that. But it is
Alec, you missed the key point from Alice's post, though. She said everyone got better, no separation between ketamine and placebo, and what drove the effect was what they thought that they had, right?
Thank you for pointing that out. It shows my uncritical eye at times. Thank you.
And again, I've nothing against that. Like, obviously, expectation and placebo effects are extremely powerful, and they're not something we should be embarrassed about. I think it's something we should try and understand and leverage and use. Because, of course, if we can harness them appropriately, maybe we don't need to expose people to ketamine at all, which is a sort of an intriguing idea. Varun, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, and thanks to the group for organizing this. I'm a psych resident at Cornell, so it's nice to be able to tune into your all's work. I was wondering, kind of thinking from like from the perspective of like internal psychological structures that get worked with clinically, how you sort of see the difference manifesting between having relaxed beliefs versus an augmentation of prior beliefs, and if you have any theories as to like how that, you know, in the future will manifest from like a clinical perspective.
Yeah, no, so I don't think this is the final word on any of this stuff, and certainly not from me. I think what I'm trying to point out is that, and maybe I wasn't clear enough, is that some beliefs relax and some beliefs strengthen, and I think that both things happen at the same time, and they may be sort of tethered to one another. Wherein, for example, if you experience lots of sensory uncertainty and you're kind of having lots of noise in your perceptual apparatus, you kind of want to come up with an explanation that dampens that down, and that's what a hallucination is, or a delusional belief. And that comes in at a sort of higher level of the perceptual hierarchy. You know, I think that's how it works. And so these sort of monolithic ideas of like, well, beliefs are just weaker or beliefs are just stronger, don't seem to be true. But I don't know the extent to which this generalizes from, say, ketamine to other interventions. I think it probably does, but I think it's an empirical question. How to use this stuff clinically? I mean, I don't treat people at all. I'm not even, you know, a pharmacologist, let alone a psychotherapist. I do think that this framework, regardless of whether beliefs weaken or strengthen, is helpful for talking to people about their current state. And I think that actually might be the quickest way to translate this work out into the clinic, is to say, well, you know, when you have hallucinations, for example, that might be because you're overweighting your perceptual beliefs. And think about the situations where that happens, right? So we have a really nice paper, like an opinion piece that we published in JAMA Psychiatry a few years ago, where we worked with somebody from the Hearing Voices movement and sort of tried to say, okay, well, given that we're showing that this might be true with regards to where hallucinations come from, can you tell us about, you know, settings in which hallucinations are better or worse for you? And interestingly, she suggested that all of the sort of situations in the world that give rise to greater perceptual uncertainty, right? Like going to a new job, traveling to a new location, you know, falling out with family members, you know, being in the dark, you know, all things where sensory uncertainty increases are situations that exacerbate your hallucinations. And so not saying that you should avoid those settings, but perhaps noticing and noting when that happens might give you a bit more of an understanding and perhaps yield more of a sense of control. That's my hope anyway. And that's about all I think I have to say about therapy at this point. I think there were some more questions in the chat.
Round three. Oh,
In the chat.
I don't think we have any new questions for you, Dr. Corlett, but Andrew's got his hand up, so let's go for round three.
Sorry. I think it'd be really fascinating if you kind of tied in some of the future work with like people's trait openness or neuroticism, because I think it definitely has implications for like clinical psychotherapy.
Yeah, so data I didn't talk about at all, but we are running in a ketamine study and hoping to run in a psychedelic study right now, are on probabilistic reversal learning and belief updating. So the extent to which you expect the world to be volatile and how you handle that when it is or isn't volatile compared to your expectation. people who are paranoid expect the world to change a great deal, but also find it hard to learn from actual volatility. And that also seems to be true for people with personality disorders, although it's different for the different personality disorders. I'm not saying we can kind of cleave them all. They're often quite correlated, but I think a neat future direction for that particular work is to try and cash out, okay, well, what are the different expectations in people who are narcissists versus have borderline personality disorder, for example? Are they more social for the people who have borderline personality disorder? It doesn't seem to be the case, actually. The people with borderline seem to be equally sensitive to social and non-social volatility. They find it all pretty unbearable, although it could be that they're perceiving that us as experimenters are imposing the non-social volatility, so they just get pissed at us. But that's to explore experimentally. But I do think it's an interesting idea to explore personality traits and the extent to which people weight prior beliefs about different topics.
It almost sounds like a semi-objective way to measure personal growth. Possibly,
yeah. I mean, what we've seen, so we're doing a ketamine study with Jerry Sanacora now with that task. And what we see, interestingly, is, and this is in people who got ketamine right after a suicide attempt. So they do the task, they get ketamine, and they do the task again a number of times. And what we see with ketamine infusion is a normalization of the prior on volatility, but perhaps some problems with prior beliefs lower down in the model about expectations of reward and about learning rates from actual rewards that they don't seem to correct in the same way. And they seem to kind of go back to normal, whereas the prior on volatility does seem to change and be sustained for quite some time after the infusion. What that means clinically, we're not sure, because we haven't related that to clinical ratings, but we've done it, and those data are there. So watch this space.
Jordan?
Phil, thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I was just wondering, I haven't really, to be honest, read the rebus very, very closely, and I'm wondering if you could just sort of re-summarize sort of
the key points. I think you
Jordan, you muted.
Yes, that would be most helpful.
Sure. So as I understand it, and it does go through various iterations, it's the idea that as I suggested with our early kind of ketamine and delusions work, that the sort of blinkers that constrain our perception, the doors of perception in sort of Aldous Huxley terms, are loosened or somewhat erased. And to put it in the sort of Bayesian terms, it's a weakening of the impact of your prior beliefs on perception, which increases your sensory noise and the noise that propagates throughout your brain. Now, the next step, which they now talk about a little bit more, is that as a response to that, you get an imposition of different prior beliefs later. So it's kind of a bit more now aligned with the way that we've been thinking. But the original version was just a relaxation of the beliefs, just to explain the acute experiences. Now that we need to explain the sort of longer term effects, I think it's a sort of reorganization and a recasting of your prior beliefs going forward. So moving people out of these ruts that they might be in terms of how they make predictions about themselves and other people. That's a really nice just so story, and I would love it to be true, but I just don't see it being aligned with actual data yet. And that's, I guess, what I'd love to see.
Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Corlett, can I ask you to just talk about what studies you have planned moving forward with psychedelics? I know you mentioned this ketamine study with Dr. Sanacora. Very eager to hear.
Absolutely. So we have one study running currently. There's also a psilocybin study for OCD where some of our tasks are being included. But I think that's been on hold since the pandemic, or at least we haven't had a great throughput of data from there. And then as a result of being sort of in a foxhole together, Manoj Dose and Fred Barrett and I are hoping to get together and include some of our tasks from the lab in some of their studies going forward. So I'm hoping to, through collaborations, kind of get some more data on this. It may not necessarily be, you know, in the context of the actual infusion, but at least before and after, I'd really like to see the data. And of course, it might involve making a visual version of the conditioned hallucinations task, because of course, the hallucinations that happen under psychedelics are often predominantly visual. I mean, there are some auditory ones too, but the overwhelming balance is towards vision, which I think is an interesting observation too. There are visual versions of conditioned hallucinations that have been done in the past. And I think it wouldn't be a great burden to switch the cues around and have like an above threshold tone predicting a flickering Gabor patch or something like that, which would be really interesting to try, I think.
Right on. I think Al actually has a visual hallucination task. Yeah, he's been working on.
Yeah.
Phil, I have a quick question for you, and this isn't quite psychedelic specific, but this something I notice a lot clinically and struggle with is when taking care of patients. Can you hear me? It's saying my internet is unstable. Okay, excellent. That, you know, discerning auditory hallucinations from hearing one's own thoughts that are intrusive, and you know, in the inpatient setting, we're constantly, of course, asking, you know, about voices, and there are more specific questions that you can try and tease these things apart. But coming at it from your end, less clinical, but very more, you know, much in the neuroscience and research setting. Can you talk a little bit about this difference of, you know, a psychotic hearing voices, hearing a dialogue from multiple people versus, you know, intrusive thoughts from people in your past that you, or your own thoughts that you, the patient can't quite dictate whether they're theirs or not?
Mm-hmm. So I think they both involve disturbances of your kind of overall inference and reality filtering mechanisms, right? The distinction between perception and imagination, and when you're not really sure whether something actually occurred, more likely to infer that it did under these infusions. But the actual content, I don't know why it's different. I did this really fun study with Mike Fox from Harvard. I don't know if you know his work on lesion network mapping. So it's this amazing approach where, you know, I showed you almost like a sort of childish sketch of all of the lesions that we'd pulled together that cause delusions. So he does that, but then he takes all of the lesion locations and imposes them on the human connectome data and says like, okay, well, what are each of these, what regions are each of these lesions talking to similarly across cases? So you end up with a circuit that's obviously cached out in resting state data, which I've already kind of called into question, and controls, so they're not the actual patients themselves. But nevertheless, it gives you an idea of like, what are, when there's damage that gives rise to a symptom, what other brain regions are those regions talking to? And we did this for auditory and visual hallucinations. So new onset auditory hallucinations from damage from a stroke or closed head injury, and likewise new onset visual hallucinations. And again, there, visual are way more common than auditory, almost like an order of magnitude more. And even the auditory ones aren't necessarily hearing voices. It's very rare to get a bang on the head and start hearing voices. It's much more common to hear, you know, tinnitus type stimuli or like animal sounds or whispering, but not often sort of full-blown voice hearing. And what we find is that both types of hallucination impinge or damage regions that are connected to the superior temporal sulcus and the cerebellum, but the visual ones in particular involve damage to V1 and striate cortices. And so there's a domain effect, but then there's an overall kind of hallucination effect too that's common to the different types. And so I would imagine that for whatever reason, either receptor densities or neurochemistry that's different between the two infusions, that one is more likely to influence the auditory and the other is more likely to influence the visual from those two circuits. And both of them obviously influence the common circuitry too. That would be my guess.
Regarding the rebus model, it sounded to me like it's less that the theory itself you don't like, it's more that there's not really any evidence to back it. I was just wondering.
I don't like the people that wrote it. I'm joking.
Yeah, that too. I was just wondering if you had any sort of alternative, like spitball ideas or thoughts or other potential explanations.
Right. So what I'd like to say, and I think the evidence supports, is that when there's a hallucination in the house, the end product is stronger prior beliefs of some sort, not weaker, although the initiating lesion or perturbation might be a weakening and an increase in sensory uncertainty. I guess I'd just like to see that kind of explored a bit more. Even in the absence of my own interests and work, I think, you know, the evidence is sort of lacking. And like I mentioned, if your only evidence base is inferences about beliefs, but from functional neuroimaging data where belief means sort of probability distribution of activity and functional connectivity, that's very different than belief that we're using in a sort of folk psychological sense, as in, you know, degree of credence regarding some proposition. And I think it's possible to align those two definitions of belief, but you can't do it just by gathering resting state data.
What about by having a lot of citations and a high impact factor?
I think that might inappropriately inflate people's credence that they associate with your testimony, but I have no other comments about that. I think, you know, the funny thing is, you know, of all of the people who might be considered curmudgeonly around psychedelics, I never imagined that I would become one of those. And it's been a really weird metamorphosis. And I still maintain that I'm open-minded about these things, but I think there's a real danger here of over-promising and under-delivering. And, you know, as people who are in the field and practicing, I think we should keep that in mind at all times. I'd much rather under-promise and over-deliver. And I know it's exciting when, you know, Netflix wants to make a documentary about you, or Michael Pollan wants to interview you, or whomever. And it's good for the field and it's good for raising awareness of the work. But if we promise people that we can cure them in a single session like this, and then that doesn't happen, it's not going to take long for people to lose faith and enthusiasm and for the hype to backfire. And when that happens, it doesn't just sort of throw cold water on the particular people who've been found out to be overpromising. It dampens the whole thing. We were just talking about this before the session began. You know, the last time psychedelics were this prominent, they went away, and people think it was because of Richard Nixon, and to some extent it was, right? The demonization of recreational use. But alongside that, there was a total change in Sandoz's enthusiasm about using these drugs in a psychiatric setting. And it was because of the difficulties and the low quality data that were being generated, the difficulties in doing good controls, and the lack of certainty about what was actually changing with the infusion. And I fear like we might go through that cycle again if we're not very careful.
With respect to ketamine, I feel like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because the clinical utilization in the community has far exceeded the indications that are actually evidence-based, and no pharmaceutical company is going to get back behind the research. You know, who's going to fund the research to figure out exactly what, you know, what it is best used for and most appropriate to use for. So
yeah, I think that's true.
I worry about a backlash a la the opioid crisis with ketamine. I see that coming in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. We ought, as psychiatrists, well, speaking for my ilk, we ought to put a position paper out there and try to get out in front of it and say, really, it's not appropriate for these medications to be being dispensed without clear diagnostic assessment by anesthesiologists and emergency med physicians all over the country right now.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's, you know, whatever problems we're having with ketamine, we will then have with psychedelics too, right? Because it's only, you know, a few years or months even behind, you know, that sort of off-label set of practices. I think we need a better understanding of who's eligible and a better understanding of what the side effects might be for that person and what the risks might be for that person. And I say that because, you know, when I was in grad school, before we knew about these miraculous antidepressant effects, you know, one population of people that I worked with was ketamine abusers in the London club scene who were taking huge amounts of ketamine every single day and inducing these awful urinary tract effects, but also getting psychotic and having delusion-like beliefs that sustained even after they abstained from using ketamine. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to people who have repeated infusions for antidepressant reasons, but it's certainly a possibility that we haven't really grappled with enough. And the data are out there, right? There are structural imaging data, there are DTI data on these people, showing very clearly, perhaps not prospectively in the way that we'd all like, but that there are changes in the brain, differences in the brain in people who've exposed themselves to quite a lot of ketamine. I don't know what the answer is, but I think this sort of cottage industry, underground kind of black market off-label use is not helping anybody in terms of making the best decisions. You asked about who's going to fund it. You know, I think the NIH is coming around to these sorts of interventions. There's clear promise. I feel like that's going to be manifest most initially and quickly and currently with the basic science work, right? So there's a lot of people who do mouse, rat, primate studies of these drugs. I'd like to see it translated into the clinical setting as well. And I think that's where, you know, worries about, which we haven't talked about at all, about, you know, conflicts of interest and industry might be assuaged a little bit. You know, being on the advisory board of somebody who's invested very healthily and wealthily in your lab must be very difficult to tell them that it's not quite as good as you thought it was going to be, or you told them it was going to be beforehand. And I think that's a real challenge. And NIH involvement has its own issues, of course. It's not a silver bullet or a magic bullet, but it's probably a bit more free of some of those concerns. So I hope that's what happens. I guess we'll see.
Hi, how are you? I have a question. What about patients who are looking just for the ketamine infusion for situational depression, but not clinically depressed?
I mean, I'm certainly not the person to give sort of prescriptive medical or clinical advice. You know, I'm sure there are people who are going to be asking for that more frequently, especially given the sort of high profile and the stories that are being told. My understanding is that the FDA does not license ketamine for that use whatsoever, but I know it's happening. And so I suppose I'd love to hear more from people on the Zoom who might be practitioners themselves and what their advice would be.
And I would actually say to those practitioners, may hold your thoughts and comment maybe under this video, which will be posted to YouTube later for our perusal. I just want to be mindful of everyone's time and Dr. Corlett's time. We're 2 minutes over. So I want to thank you once again, Dr. Corlett, for coming to speak to us. It was a really fantastic talk. Really got people excited. So thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to me. I really appreciate it.
And thanks everyone for coming, asking great questions. All right.